Yo, what's going on? Mike from Mike Talk Sports. Jalin Turner versus Dan Hooker just got made for UFC 290. Let me tell you guys why Jalin Turner will beat Dan Hooker. This fight's going to be an absolute banger. It's going to be a stand-up war. These are two huge 155ers in there. Dan Hooker's a guy 6 foot tall, 75-inch reach, and then Jalin Turner is 6'3" with a 77-inch reach. He is called the Tarantula for a reason. Both of these guys will switch it up in terms of their stances, but for the most part, Jalin Turner is going to operate from the southpaw, and for the most part, Dan Hooker is going to operate from the orthodox stance. Even though these guys have very similar reaches, in my opinion, Jalin Turner simply uses his reach more effectively. Even though Dan Hooker has a really nice jab, really nice teeps to the body to keep his opponent at range, Jalin Turner, man, he does the same thing with those teeps to the bodies, those side kicks to the bodies, the switch side kicks to the bodies. He has a really nice right hand jab as well. But the reason why I say Jalin Turner uses his range a little bit better than Dan Hooker is Dan Hooker on his hooks really likes to get into the inside boxing range, get into the pocket, and have those really tight, powerful hooks, whereas Jalin Turner has really powerful hooks as well, but he throws them with an insane amount of range, of motion, which really allows Jalin Turner to throw almost every single strike at range, which is really important for this fight. I get it, Jalin Turner doesn't have the best record in the world. He's 13-6, but he is 6-3 in the UFC. He's lost to some really good guys, some absolute killers like Mateusz Gamrot, who realistically didn't do much damage to Jalin Turner. Some people thought Jalin Turner won this fight. I do think Gamrot won this fight, but it really was Gamrot out-scrambling and out-grappling Jalin Turner, whereas, again, this Dan Hooker fight is going to end up on the feet. Whereas Dan Hooker's actually 2-4 in his last 6. Now, he is coming off of a really nice bounce-back win versus Claudio Puelles, but man, I'm not going to lie. This last Dan Hooker fight really makes me think Jalin Turner is going to win this fight. Why do I say that? First off, it's the head movement and lack thereof. Both of these guys honestly have pretty bad head movement. They really keep their head on the center line, and in my opinion, I really can just picture Jalin Turner repeatedly catching Dan Hooker with a teep to the body or a side kick switch to the body and then overhand right or just right lead hook combination. Jalin Turner loves throwing that kick to the body and then lead right hand hook combination, and in my opinion, this is going to land all day on Dan Hooker. Getting into Dan Hooker's last fight, it was his first fight back at 155 when he tried to fight at 145 in his previous fight where he lost to Arnold via a pretty big KO. In my opinion, Dan Hooker has just taken so much damage lately in his career, not only in that fight, but of course the Michael Chandler fight, and then the one everyone points to, it's that Dustin Poirier absolute war. And this is where I kind of get sad looking at this matchup, Jalin Turner versus Dan Hooker. Prime Dan Hooker, in my opinion, probably beats Jalin Turner, especially the prime Dan Hooker that showed up against Dustin the Diamond Poirier. But this version of Dan Hooker, guys, please watch Dan Hooker's last fight. It was a nice win, but man, he looked insanely slow out there. Every single kick he threw, you could tell he was throwing a kick 5 seconds before he was throwing the kick. He was just really telegraphing his kicks and just telegraphing every single strike out there. Again, he looked really, really slow and stiff. His defense and his striking defense did not look good, and his opponent really just could not capitalize on this because his opponent really just was not a good striker. Whereas Jalin Turner really is hitting his prime right now. He's 27 years old. Again, he had a really rough start to his MMA career, but he's honestly looked really good in the UFC. I can honestly envision it going into the third round. Jalin Turner is winning the first 2 rounds. One thing about Jalin Turner, he's a very opportunistic grappler and a very opportunistic submission artist. On paper, Dan Hooker has a higher degree in his jiu-jitsu belt. I completely understand. On paper, Dan Hooker is probably the better grappler, but in my opinion, Jalin Turner has good enough takedown defense to really keep Dan Hooker on the feet in this fight. And then where I really like Jalin Turner is he has some really nice chokes. He has a really nice guillotine. He has a really nice rear naked choke. And in my opinion, I think he stuns Dan Hooker, and then he honestly might shoot a submission in the third round. I think Jalin Turner either gets a third round stoppage via TKO or submission. I can honestly see both of those things happening. Again, very opportunistic with his grappling. Or I can honestly just see him out jabbing and out pointing Dan Hooker over 3 rounds. Again, I just feel as though Jalin Turner is just so smooth at this point in his career. He's so fluid with his movement. His head movement is not great, and I do think Dan Hooker, with those nice teeps to the body, with that nice jab straight he does possess from the orthodox, I think he'll be able to get on the outside foot of Jalin Turner and land some nice strikes because, again, Jalin Turner does absorb some strikes in his fights when they are on the stand-up. But for the most part, man, I just can't get past that Dan Hooker weight cut. Then he goes back to 155. And ever since, he just looks extremely, extremely slow out there. Again, I know he's coming off of a win, but I genuinely was not very impressed with his last win, to be completely honest. So yeah, I'm going to be picking Jalin Turner to win this fight. Thanks for listening, guys. Let me know in the comment section below, who do you have in this banger, Jalin Turner versus Dan Hooker, and how do you think the fight will play out?